I was standing in front of the great fire in the Hermitage, just another tourist shuffling through the gallery, until the light in that canvas stopped me cold. This isn't ordinary firelight over Moscow. The city is crowned by a blinding core, a white sphere so intense it swallows color, with buildings around it torn open in a perfect ring. The distance is wrong too, no soft haze, no warm flicker, just a harsh, surgical clarity stretching far past where smoke should have drowned the horizon. They tell you the artist was just dramatizing Napoleon's advance, painting a romantic inferno to heighten the tragedy. But the physics in those brushstrokes tell a different story. And once you notice that, you can't unsee what that light really looks like. I stared at it for hours, zooming in until the paint itself became a landscape of ridges and cracks. I traced the angles of the shadows, measured how quickly the brightness falls off from the center across the skyline, then went home and put those curves next to photographs from Hiroshima and early nuclear test films. The decay of light, the way it eats the city and fades into the distance, matches almost one-to-one with documented nuclear blast signatures, not with a symbolic sun or a painter's flourish. That's not imagination. That's an eyewitness trying to translate impossible physics into oil and pigment. You might think this sounds impossible. You might be checking the description of this video right now. Stay with me. Look at what the museum plaque actually does. It pins this moment of impossible light to a neat date, a neat battle. A single city conveniently explained by war. According to the official story, nuclear detonations were still more than a century away. Unknown, unnamed, unthinkable. So what you're seeing must be metaphor, nothing more. But when a so-called metaphor matches the documented behavior of a specific 20th century weapon, that label starts to look less like context and more like camouflage. So I walked out of that hole with one question. If this light was real, was Moscow the only place that saw it that year? I found the answer not in museums, but in the dry, supposedly boring paperwork of that era. City reports, parish chronicles, merchants' diaries, documents from different languages and rival governments all quietly record their own great fire in the same narrow window of time. When you mark them on a map, those fires don't scatter randomly. They form a band across the northern hemisphere, hitting capitals, trade hubs, and fortified towns in an almost rhythmic sequence. That's not how stray lanterns and careless stoves remake the world. That's a synchronized ignition pattern. And once I saw that line of flame stretching across continents, I went looking for how those fires began. Look at the first-hand testimonies from people who happened to be outside when the sky changed. Again and again, they described the same terrifying order. First, a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, whiter than day, as if the heavens split open, and only after that, the roar, the rush of wind, the breaking of glass, the collapsing walls. Light before sound, thermal energy racing ahead of the shockwave, a blinding pulse followed by a hammer of air that is textbook nuclear detonation behavior, not a warehouse blaze slowly catching. They had no word for radiation back then, no drawings of mushroom clouds, so they reached for religious language and sheer terror. And it's what happens after that brief white noon that seals the pattern. I found medical notes and private letters describing people who never touched the flames, who stood miles from any visible fire, falling apart in the days and weeks that followed. They write of skin reddening and sloughing off without burn contact, of hair dropping out in tangles, of gums bleeding, teeth loosening, unending vomiting, and a fatigue so deep it felt like the soul was leaving the body. Local doctors called it malignant fever, putrid flux, wasting illness, because that was the only language they had. But if you put their symptom lists next to a modern manual, you get a clean match with acute radiation syndrome. That's not smoke inhalation, that's bone marrow being shredded by ionizing energy. And when you match the timing of those illnesses with the dates and locations of the flashes, the overlap is too precise to ignore. Official historians smooth this over with a shrug. War, famine, infection, stress, they say, as if hardship alone can replicate the medical profile of a radiological disaster. They blame psychological panic for exaggerated descriptions, as if collective fear can peel skin and empty skeletons from the inside out. Let me show you something they don't teach in history class. When you align those old case clusters with declassified nuclear test data, the onset times, the geographic spread, the heightened impact on children and pregnant women, the resemblance stops being literary and becomes forensic. And the bodies aren't the only things that show the signature of a weapon no one was supposed to have. Examine the damage reports. The sketches of ruined streets created by surveyors and engineers sent in afterward. You see rows of buildings folded in the same direction, pushed away from a single central point, doors blasted off their hinges, stone facades sheared and peeled as if a giant hand ripped them open, while structures only a few streets away stand almost unharmed except for sharp, ghostly outlines on their shaded sides. That isn't how a normal firestorm moves, licking outward in messy, wind-driven patterns. That's blast overpressure and thermal shadowing, the same negative silhouettes we see in controlled explosion studies. Where something solid blocked the flash, the surface behind it stayed darker, cooler, untouched. And once you recognize those stenciled edges of destruction, you start noticing something even stranger in the rubble. Look at the surviving masonry from those ruined districts, the bricks and cobblestones people step on without thinking. You find walls whose outer faces are glazed into a glassy sheen, while the inner cores remain rough and brick-like. Paving stones welded together along one edge and completely normal along another. Stonework that looks as if it spent only an instant inside a furnace before the heat vanished. That's not the slow cook of an ordinary urban fire. That's surface vitrification from an impossible intensity of heat applied in a heartbeat, the same effect seen at known nuclear ground zero sites. And when you track which construction layers show that glazing, they line up with that same catastrophic season that's supposed to be just a chapter of conventional war and accidental blazes. Follow those clues outward, and the pattern repeats far from Moscow, in cities that supposedly had nothing to do with Napoleon's march. Coastal ports, inland capitals, commercial crossroads on other continents all show the same trio of scars. Eyewitness tales of unnatural light, medical records of mysterious fevers with radiation-style symptoms, and stonework that has partially turned to glass. That's not a series of local misfortunes. That's a global signature stamped on distant locations in the same tight span of months. And if vitrified stone is there, you have to ask what else might be lingering in those ruins. Investigators who've gone back with modern instruments report something the tourist brochures never mention. In the same strata tied to that fiery year, the radiation readings tick above background, not at cinematic, glowing in the dark levels, but as a steady, wrong note humming inside brick and soil where it should not be. That's not old building material. That's residual contamination from high-energy events, the invisible fingerprint of nuclear weapons locked into the skeleton of the landscape. Put that together with the blast patterns, the vitrification, and the recorded symptoms, and you're staring at a complete detonation profile anchored to a time period officially labeled as pre-nuclear. And when those profiles appear thousands of kilometers apart, the scale of what happened finally snaps into focus. Picture a world map, not with borders and flags, but with the ruined districts from that year marked in red. Certain clusters blaze out, major ports, river junction cities, inland capitals, all sharing the same scars, the glassed stone, the odd radiation hum, the amputated neighborhoods where entire quarters simply stop with no organic transition. That's not one outbreak of fire. That's a coordinated strike pattern, a simultaneous global culling dressed up as disconnected tragedies. They blame a careless match here, a retreating army there, acts of God scattered in between, anything except a technological onslaught. I want you to go look at the oldest building in your city or town. Look at the foundation. Look at the stone. Tell me in the comments what you find. Tell me if you see the marks. Because once you admit these weren't isolated events, you're forced into the question no one in official history wants you asking. Who, exactly, was the target of a worldwide extermination that left the survivors thinking only of fire and war? I found the first hint in things that somehow slipped through the edit. Old maps, engineering drawings, and inscriptions that hadn't yet been updated to fit the modern storyline. Scattered through them is a name you're taught to dismiss as vague, remote, unimportant, Tartaria, not as a minor backwater, but as a vast, structured empire whose centers sit precisely where the worst of those red scars glow on the map. Its major cities overlap the heaviest vitrification, its trade hubs sit atop the strongest radiation anomalies, and then, right after that catastrophic season, it simply vanishes from political charts while other, smaller powers suddenly sprout where it once stood. That's not collateral damage. That's a kill grid laid over a civilization. And once you see that grid, the official story of the era starts to crumble. They tell you those campaigns were about familiar nations clashing for territory and pride. It wasn't a war. It was an extermination. Look at the reconstruction tales that show up immediately after. New regimes bragging about building monumental cities in impossibly short spans, while the foundations below them are far older and far more sophisticated than anything the newcomers could have realistically produced on that timeline. That's not heroic construction. That's occupation moving into the empty shells of someone else's infrastructure and claiming it as your own. To make that theft stick, you need more than stone and mortar. You need a narrative that insists the previous owners were primitive or non-existent. Now step even further back, into texts that get quarantined as myth, so you never compare them to modern data. In the Mahabharata, there is a weapon described whose radiance rivals 1,000 suns, whose detonation leaves bodies charred, cities erased, survivors wandering with sores, hair gone, and land rendered poisonous for generations. Strip away the poetic framing, and you're left with a disturbingly precise technical description. A high-yield, radiological blast with long-term contamination, the exact pattern we've just traced in that early 19th century catastrophe. That's not a primitive imagination stumbling into coincidence. That's an earlier memory of the same class of weapon, encoded in story because the language of science wasn't available. And once you see that humanity has recorded nuclear-style exterminations before, this more recent one stops looking like an unthinkable anomaly. Here's the pivot they never want you to reach. That fiery year wasn't the chaotic peak of gunpowder-era warfare accidentally spinning out of control. It was a deliberate, technologically exact extermination of the Tartarian Empire, using tools humanity had already wielded in earlier ages, then shoved into legend to hide the continuity. The vitrified districts, the lingering radiation, the synchronized global pattern. The way it maps perfectly onto Tartarian centers, all of it converges on a single conclusion. This was not war for advantage, it was erasure for domination. Because if Tartaria had remained, with its networks, its architecture, its knowledge, its memory, the lie that our civilization is the first and only advanced, one could never have taken root. And the cover-up? Once you know where to focus, it screams from the record. Names disappear from maps, entire building styles are rebranded as the hasty work of later, less capable cultures, and historical timelines get crushed so tightly that centuries of technological and architectural evolution are crammed into a few decades labeled Industrial Revolution. That's not organic progress. That's a reset narrative slapped over a wounded planet. An emergency story to explain why so many cities sit on top of grand, half-erased frameworks they didn't design. If this pattern is showing you a different past, there's more to see. You know what to do. Because what they call modernity begins to look like a salvage operation on a scorched inheritance. So go back with me, in your mind, to that gallery in the Hermitage and that painting of Moscow with its impossible white sun over the rooftops. Understand that you are not looking at romantic exaggeration, You are watching, through an artist's traumatized eyes, the instant an empire was annihilated by weapons we pretend only arrived a century later. That global firestorm was not an accident of history. It was the calculated nuclear extermination of Tartaria, followed by the most aggressive rewrite of human memory ever attempted. And once you recognize the scorch marks in stone, the glass that shouldn't exist, the invisible hum in old walls, and the silenced name beneath our feet, the light in that painted sky stops being a mystery and becomes a confession, leaving only one question. What do you do now that you've seen it? The hidden nuclear war that erased Tartaria, the painting that proves our history is a lie, how a secret nuclear extermination reset the world. They say the nuclear age began in the 20th century. This video tears that illusion apart. Starting with a single painting in the Hermitage, we follow a trail of impossible light signatures, eyewitness accounts, medical reports, vitrified stone, and anomalous radiation, all converging on one forbidden conclusion. A coordinated, global nuclear extermination of the Tartarian Empire in the early 19th century. You'll see how simultaneous great fires across major cities align like a targeting grid, how ancient texts like the Mahabharata describe the same weapons, and how our entire historical narrative was rebuilt to hide a reset on a planetary scale. Watch to the end, then look at your own city with new eyes.